not allocated presence, love, here, now. Breathing in and breathing out, connecting with this web of experience, this web of existence. And for this experience of God's love, we give thanks. And so it is that together we say, Amen. Wrestling through the night. So, Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, wrote a book called Keep It True Lent. Charles was he was one that was not defined by convention, and he chose to explore the traditions, the major traditions of the world, in a time when the evangelical energy was just starting to come together in the U.S. But he stepped out and said, based upon Myrtle Fillmore's healing through prayer, he decided to explore the major traditions of the world to find out what among those traditions was a common thread. That golden thread was an objective for him, and in his exploration, he came up with a perspective, a worldview, a theology that celebrated the various traditions, but brought them together into the context of Christianity. He referred to his theology as practical Christianity, and practical in that it was to be practiced. It was not to be worshipped. It was not to be respected. It was to be practiced. And so he came up with this theology that over the course of 50 years, he was able to express in a number of different works. Keep It True Lent was one of his later expressions in which he took the tradition of Lent, the 4th century tradition that actually probably the essence of that 4th century tradition was the celebration of the arising of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. But it was a time of preparation, and it was considered, excluding the worship days, it was a 40-day period. 40 days in the biblical tradition is a time of completion. And so the 40 days began prior to Easter. The 40 days were marked at the beginning by Ash Wednesday, which, of course, was on the 14th of February this year. So this Easter tradition of Lent came about as a result of the participants, the followers of Jesus, the participants of the way, wanting to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And so we have brought forth the Lenten tradition as a time of penitence, as a time of sacrifice, as a time of giving up. Well, Fillmore didn't see it that way. What he saw was that it was a metaphor for the spiritual journey. It was a metaphor for the individual's arising to their own resurrection. And as a spiritual journey, he saw it as a time of as a time of preparation, as a time of a quest, a conquest, if you will, a conquest of the ego. He looked at the symbol of the cross as being the crossing out of ego consciousness. That is, the crossing out of the sense of separation between each other and separation from God. Of course, in Miracles, in fact, looks upon it in a very similar way, in that our spiritual journey is about the dissolving of this concept of separation between ourselves and God. So when Charles prepared this work, he saw the spiritual journey as an individual quest for the arising in consciousness of this celebration of our oneness with God. Oh, there it is. Thank you for putting that up there. And in Keep a True Lent, he says, all things are possible to us, only we must believe. Believe what? We must believe in ourselves, in this innate spiritual man in us, and we must encourage him. Encourage him with what? With sound words, with affirmations of almightiness. Then we shall have the key to the overcoming world. Our most important study in our own mind, not only the intellectual mind, but the spiritual mind. Know thyself was inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and it must be inscribed on our own temple, over the door of our mind. Know thyself. We must become acquainted with our own mind. And he saw this spiritual journey as being a journey that was based, or that was fueled and nourished by courage. Last week we talked about the awareness of divine love as an essential element of our personal quest. And he also saw courage as being an essential element of this process. So, courage. How do we approach our world? Someone asked me yesterday. I went to a memorial yesterday for my friend, and one of our mutual friends was there, and he said, "So David, who are you trying to be with your long hair?" And I said, well, actually, I'm trying to be myself, but I still don't know him. I'm still trying to find out who he is. And that perhaps that is a quest that we all have, is coming to know who we really are, coming to know who we are as a child of God, as an expression of the Christ in this moment, as a descendant of the Most High, and at one with the Most High. So attempting to know who we are is a process of the spiritual quest. Mark Napo, many of you know Mark. He is a well-known poet, becoming well-known poet. He has a book, Finding Inner Courage. And in that book, in the introduction, in fact, he says the word courage comes from the Latin cor, which literally means heart. The original use of the word courage meant to stand by one's core. This is a striking concept that reinforces the belief found in almost all traditions that living from the center is what enables us to face whatever life has to offer. To come into an awareness of who we are at our very core allows us the courage to face anything that comes our way. And so the spiritual quest of one of trying, of arising or coming into the awareness of our essence of who we are is the spiritual journey. So we go about our lives. We have stuff that comes up. We have things that occur. One thing that struck me as I was in this gathering, it wasn't really a memorial service, it was a memorial gathering. Janet had friends. She grew up in Boulder, Columbine Systems, where I was the personnel manager. I hired her back in, I think, 1975. She was she was like a what are those balls that are in dance halls? You know, the multifaceted. Yeah, yeah. So she was like that. She was a light, but she had so many different facets that she was really a sparkle rather than a light. You know, you wait a bit and you see a little bit different view of her. She was a very, very bright soul. And at the memorial service we had, or at the memorial gathering, we had people from all phases of her life. She had moved back to Toledo and married a dentist back there, and then back there for 20 years or so, and then moved back to Boulder about 15 years ago. And so at this gathering, there were people that had flew in from Toledo. There were childhood friends. There were friends from Columbine. There were friends from her Toledo stay. And then, of course, friends that she had reconnected with and made out here in the last 15 years. I was struck by her husband, the dentist, Chris Chamberlain. He was... we talked for just a bit, but I gained from that short conversation that it wasn't that he was all right with what happened, but he was standing in courage of what happened. He understood. He said going into it, it wasn't a great shock. It was a great disappointment. But it wasn't a great shock because the doctor had already informed us that, you know, this operation, it was 2 operations, one on Tuesday and one on Wednesday. And this operation, this was a week and a half ago, these 2 operations were pretty significant operations. And so she had the 2 operations, and the second one on Wednesday. On Thursday, she was in rehab, and Friday, not rehab, but, you know, convalescing at the hospital. And then come Saturday, she was good enough to go home. So she went home, and she was not feeling well on Saturday evening. So they went back into the ER at Boulder Community, and then they transferred her down to St. Luke's on Saturday night because they wanted to monitor her. And they realized down at St. Luke's that she had some embolism arising in her lungs. And so they were watching her. She seemed to be doing fine. And 3 a.m. on Monday morning, she was asleep, and the monitors went off, and she flatlined, and there was no recovery from that. Chris was stoic. That often is the case, though, when things like this happen, right? There's a period of time where you just have to get through. You have to get arrangements made. You have to make sure that, you know, the gathering is being hosted properly. You have to just get the next task done. In fact, he went back into work. That was on Monday. He went back into work on Friday because he just couldn't stay at home anymore, even though his 2 sons had flown in from Yellowstone and from Phoenix. Their families came with them. Their wives came with them. So, you know, it wasn't as if he was there by himself, but he needed to get back to work. And I think that over the course of the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, there will be a time when he will start to become connected with this new experience. And this new experience he is going to have is certainly one that is going to require courage. There is In the Old Testament, there's a story of Jacob. Jacob was the second born of twins. Esau and Jacob were born of Rebekah and Isaac. Esau was a man of the field. He was an excellent hunter. He was a great marksman. He understood all of the skills of the contemporary man in the 1500 BCE era. And he was, as the first of the twins out of the womb, he was the one that was offered the birthright. I mean, that was, in the tradition of the Hebrew people at that time, the firstborn was the one that gained the birthright. Well, Jacob, being the second, actually, Jacob comes from the word hanging on, because it was said that when Esau was born, Jacob had a hold of the heel of Esau as Esau was brought forth. And so Jacob was the second born, not given the birthright. He was, as it said in Scripture, he was a man of the tents. He was not an outdoors guy. He stuck around inside. He did the inside things rather than the outside things. And so he was one who prepared the food. Well, when Esau had come back from a hunting trip, he was famished. And so he smelled this great lentil soup that was being prepared by Jacob. And so he came in and he says, "Give me a bowl of soup. I'm hungry. I'm famished. I'm about to die." And Jacob said, "Well, I will, but you need to sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Well, what the hell? I'm going to die if I don't have something to eat. So yeah, you got my birthright." So this light-hearted exchange occurred in the early days. So Jacob had in his mind, though, that he was going to gain the birthright somehow. Well, it turns out that Esau married a Hittite, and Esau was, in marrying the Hittite, Esau was not well considered by his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. In fact, from that point on, Rebekah schemed with Jacob for Jacob to gain the birthright. And so as Isaac aged, he was becoming more and more feeble, but in particular, he was losing his eyesight. So he had summoned Esau to bring him some food, because he was going to give him a blessing. He was going to bless him with the birthright, because he knew that he was about to die. And Rebekah warned Jacob, you'd better step up, because now's the time. You need to gain that birthright. He's expecting Esau. And Jacob said, "Well, my brother is very hairy in his arms and hands." And so Rebekah said, "Here, take this bowl of food, and here, put on the skin of a lamb on your hand. And that way, when Isaac feels your hand as you hand him the bowl, he will be convinced that you are Esau, and he will give you the birthright." And so it was. That is how Jacob gained the birthright. Well, Esau didn't like this. In fact, Jacob left the country when Esau realized what had happened. And he had gone off to another place, and he had actually gained a good deal of prosperity, of wealth in that other place. But he wanted to come home, and as Jacob decided he was going to come home, he was afraid of what Esau would do to him. Esau had 400 soldiers that were working with him. And so Jacob felt that his merry band of 200 or so were going to be overwhelmed by Esau. So as he was approaching the valley where Esau lived, where Isaac died, he sent his servants ahead with 200 head of cattle, with 200 donkeys, with 200 sheep, and offered those as gifts to Esau, in the hope that offering these gifts to Esau would have alleviated Esau's anger. Well, as it turns out, it worked that way. As the servants were off, they negotiated with Esau. Esau took the gifts, and so he sent back to word back to Jacob, "Come on down." And so Jacob sent all of his possessions, all of his family across the river, Jabbok, and he was alone. And in that, wait a minute, did I pass? There it is. Okay. So the same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Interesting thing about this passage is that, first of all, he was alone. But we had this wrestling match that went on all night. But he was alone. He embraced him all night, but he was alone. So, what is that about? How many of you have had some kind of tribulation and you've fallen asleep at night, or you've tried to fall asleep at night, and you've had to wrestle with this, whatever it was, all night? That is what is being represented here. It is an all-night wrestling match between Jacob and Jacob. Right? And why would that be? Why would he have this wrestling going on after the story that I just related to you? Perhaps he was still feeling guilty about his theft of the birthright. Perhaps he felt that the gifts that he offered Esau were not enough. Perhaps he felt that whatever was going to come down was his just desserts. And he was reconciling himself to that outcome, whatever that was. As I was talking to Chris at the gathering yesterday, I gathered that he was reconciled with what happened. I'm not sure that will be the case 2 weeks from now, right? But in the moment, he was reconciled with what had happened. And the courage that we summon to wrestle the man, the courage that we summon to get through our individual tribulations, is one of an inner grappling, right? It's an inner battle that we face. And so, as we've covered that. As we look again at our daily word, comfort, the inner feeling of freedom that expresses itself outwardly through peace of mind only comes from being fully aligned with the power of Spirit, knowing fully who you are. I feel and radiate that feeling in the face of every challenge in my life and in the lives of others as well. It is an essential part of my spiritual purpose. Making choices from a centered sense of comfort is an essential part of my spiritual practice. I maintain that feeling of peace in my interactions with others, allowing it to radiate throughout my world. Well, as we look at A Course in Miracles, lesson 48, we see there is nothing to fear. The idea for today simply states a fact. It is not a fact to those who believe in illusions, but illusions are not facts. In truth, there is nothing to fear. It is very easy to recognize this, but it is very difficult to recognize it for those who want illusions to be true. Now, A Course in Miracles talks about the two worlds, the world of illusion and the world of truth. The world of illusion is based upon this presumption that we are separate from each other and from God. And the world of truth is based upon the awareness that there is no separation. A Course in Miracles talks about the holding up of this world of illusion is based upon fear. Fear is the primary tool of that aspect of consciousness that insists upon our separation from each other and from God. That aspect of consciousness we call the ego. And the ego relies upon fear as a means of maintaining this sense of separation. And that is the foundation of the illusion of the world. So this is talking about there is no thing to fear, because fear is a subject of the illusion, and it is not real. The only thing that is real is love. We talked about unconditional love last week, divine love. It wasn't love of the contract of the world, but it was love that was unlimited, it was unconditional, it was not allocated to anyone, it was just given to the moment, unconditionally. There is nothing to fear, because in the real world, in the world of truth, there is only love. And love erases, dissolves this sense of fear. There is nothing to fear. And this is really a state of consciousness, right? It is a choice that we make to let love be our guiding light, to let love be our experience, to let love be who we are in this moment. As we go into the New Testament, in Mark 9, verses 17 through 28, I think it is, someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. And whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And when I ask your disciples to cast it out, but they could not do so." He answered them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it threw the boy into convulsions, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the father said, "From childhood. It has often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us." Jesus said, "If you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." That's often our thing, right? Yeah, I know that I need to believe this, but oh man, I'm having a hard time. When Jesus saw that the crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You spirit that keep this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up. He said he was able to, and he was able to stand. And when the boy had entered the house, when Jesus had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And Jesus said to them, "This kind can only come out through prayer." Now remember, we said that prayer is not about things of the world, but rather it's about consciousness. Jesus is saying here that it's not about having to fix something out there. You need to fix this in here. You need to transform your consciousness to be one of a believer. Now, traditional Christianity says, oh yeah, I'm a believer. I believe that Jesus is one Son of God. He came, died for my sins, and I am saved. That kind of belief is not what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is talking about the transformation of our own consciousness to accept that this out here is not necessarily true. That the appearances of this out here is not necessarily true. That it is an inner journey. It is a transformation of our own consciousness, which is about accepting God as present, God as connected, and each and every one of us has the potential to be the expression of that Christ light. That takes courage. Then in the face of all of the stuff out there, in the face of what seems to be the illusion out there, it takes courage. A couple of nights ago, I was watching Seth Meyers. Did anyone see Seth Meyers a couple of days ago? J.J. Tota. You know J.J. Tota? How many of you have heard of J.J. Tota? Well, you will. J.J. Tota. This young man is now 16 years old. 16. Listen to this. I was different. I didn't want to do things the boys were doing all the time. Sometimes I didn't want to do any of it. I always played with the girl toys and the girly things, and I always felt guilty. I felt like I was doing something wrong by crossing that line. So I'd hide it, all of it. I'd keep my thoughts to myself. For the first 5 years of my life, I hid who I was. Now, let's just stop a moment. I have a granddaughter who's turning 6 here in another month. I just can't imagine her having the presence of mind at the age of 5 to understand that there was who she was and there was who the world expected her to be. When I turned 5, I was done trying to be something I wasn't. I was tired. I realized that not being myself is a punishment for something I didn't do wrong. Not being who I truly am was not a complete solution, but rather a temporary solution to a permanent problem. At Mother's Day tea in our kindergarten class, I chose to wear a pink sequin top and ballet jelly flats. I felt killer, and I didn't care what anyone thought. That was my first bravest moment. All the kids stared at me, talked about me, and wanted nothing to do with me. And in fact, throughout his elementary school time, in this conversation with Seth Meyers the other night, throughout this time, he expressed that he only had two friends for the entire time. Now, this kid, at the age of 7, had a stand-up routine at a comedy store. Okay? At that point, he was a professional comic. This kid is amazing. He is such an extraordinary light. No question. He is proof of reincarnation. He is proof that there is this thing called an old soul. He is an old soul. He is starring in the NBC sitcom The Champions. I think that's actually about to premiere here in the next month or so. And you hear him talk. He sounds like a very, very aware 30-year-old. You know, someone who is so in touch with who he is that He is willing and able to confront anything. He is an extraordinary light, and there's all kinds of YouTubes of his performances. He's an actor. He's a dance man. He is an extraordinary talent, and I suggest you do some YouTubes of J.J. Tota and just get to know this kid. He is going to be the subject of many conversations over the course of the next several years. So, having the courage to be who you are in the face of the illusion that surrounds us is an essential part of our spiritual journey. Be willing to look at the essence of who you are, regardless of what others think. Yeah, I'm trying to emulate David Ridge, but I'm trying to figure out who David Ridge is. And frankly, it's about time. We'll have our meditation. It is in the quiet hour that we can honestly ask ourselves, who am I? As we settle into that space in front of the altar of God within, as we settle into that quiet, loving space, let us ask ourselves, who am I? As we breathe in that essence of God, as we allow that love to flow through us, to touch every aspect of our consciousness, let us ask, who am I? As we are challenged by the tribulation that faces us, the challenges that confront us, the disappointments that arise within our experience, let us ask the question, who am I? As we come to be comfortable in this quiet time, as we allow ourselves to let go of the baggage of the past, of the expectations of others, of the expectations of ourselves, let us ask this question, who am I? And allow that question to reside in consciousness. It's not one that has to be answered now, but it is a question that can continue to fuel our inquiry, our quest. Who am I? Allow the answers to bubble up as they might, and test them. Test them with the litmus of the two great commandments. Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. And let that answer be placed before those commandments. Is this answer allowing me to love God with all my heart? Is it allowing me to love my neighbor as myself? Who am I? find comfort in the question without needing the answer. And let the answer reveal themselves in their own time. And join the quest. Who am I? And as we come back into this time and space with this question comfortably resting in our consciousness, let us come back